And yeah, I'd be curious to hear what your thoughts are on how that lands. Um, let me go on to section 6 of the survey, performance stressors. So this examines how stressors such as burnout and music performance anxiety impact musicians' overall well-being and health. So you can consider your general well-being and experience of MPA in the before times, and then your well-being during the pandemic as an inactive or less active performer, and how that's impacting MPA. So this is kind of just a little snapshot of music performance, how people reported music performance anxiety, their experience of it in the pandemic. Um, and so this may have, of course, fluctuated or changed, but it's nice to have a snapshot of data to start with, since we literally have no prior studies on our community. So with these types of indicators. So yeah, so here is question 24, music performance anxiety's impact on well-being and mental health. This was a critical question to me as a musician, just from my own experience of highs and lows as a performer. And I was curious to see how people reported their experience of music performance anxiety and highs and lows. Um, and I'm also curious at how this is also related to burnout. Okay, so here we go. Here we can see 15% reported that music performance anxiety gives a positive impact, and it gives them highs. 10% reported a somewhat more positive impact. A large majority here, almost 40%, at 38% here, reported equally positive and negative. So there's highs and lows. 15% reported somewhat more negative impact. And then 5% reported a negative impact on their overall well-being, and it causes them constant acute stress. 12% over here, almost 13% reported there's no impact. Music performance anxiety doesn't have any effect on their overall well-being on or off stage. So that's nice to note. There's no impact there. And then we have a small, almost 3% category reporting other in some regard. And so I thought this is interesting because the origin of the study of music performance anxiety actually begins, I think, in 1908 with the Yerkes-Dodson law, which was a psychology study of mice and how mice were able to navigate a maze, and how fast and how they performed and their stress levels during. And what they found from studying mice was that there's an optimal point of performance. You have to be at an optimal point of arousal to perform at your highest. And you don't want to be too high, because you can, for example, start maybe shaking, or your hands get too sweaty and you can't focus and you can't play your instrument. Or maybe your muscles tense up or freeze, and then you can't quite get the notes sounding the best you can possibly on your instrument. So there's kind of a balance where you don't want to be too aroused, but you don't want to be under aroused, so that you are in the most optimal point, right? And so I think a lot of musicians try to achieve this, and there are also some interesting studies on drugs that musicians take to regulate this, or maybe you have some beers before a gig, or you might be feeling, depends on the night, how you might regulate your own energy to give the best performance. And there's also some interesting studies on the best drugs for musicians to take. Beta blockers are the most, I think, commonly and best medication prescribed for performance anxiety, and that generally helps people in high stress situations to remain calm but alert. And I'm by no means recommending these. I'm just parroting studies that I've read, and I could share those with you if you're interested too. There are also reports on the impact of psilocybin on musicians and marijuana and various recreational drugs also that are pretty interesting. And some of my classmates in the program at Sheffield got focused on this area of research particularly, and we had like a funny study group on this. But this is sort of going on a tangent here, but so I'll keep going on with music performance anxiety here. And one of the leading scholars on music performance anxiety is named Diana Kenny. And oh, sorry, I don't know if you can see this, but it's disappearing in San Francisco. She's based in Australia and has done, I think, she's one of the world's leading scholars on music performance anxiety. And she's written a lot of really great books and articles on this, so I recommend her if you're curious. So okay, let's go on to the next question. To what degree does MPA affect your daily life? So here we have 17% said never, 30% said rarely, 40% said sometimes, 9% said often, and almost 4% said always. I think that's interesting because, you know, when I was heavily gigging, I felt like I was constantly experiencing highs and lows and forcing my body through vibrations, and trying to store my energy to put my body through those vibrations, to be a rhythm section player, to keep the groove going, to connect with other humans. And, you know, I would feel that all of my energy went to music, and you know, I would have to recover, you know, so I feel like, I don't know, personally, I might at that time have reported it always affected my daily life, but at other periods where I'm less active, it might, you know, not be in the sometimes, or, you know, rarely, or, you know, perhaps this could be comparable to how often are you gigging. So you know, I think more research needs to be done on that data to kind of really get a clear understanding of how MPA impacts us. Okay, so here we go. 26. How professional jazz musicians reported handling acute music performance anxiety. So if you're really in a stressful situation, or maybe you have a gig or a concert that you are really having a lot of anxiety about, perhaps preparing for and then executing. There seems to be an arc when it comes to music performance anxiety of a gig, where, at least for me, it starts like the day that it's booked, or the day I take the gig, until the day on the calendar that the gig is. And there's some kind of arc in terms of preparing to practice, it's on my mind, and, you know, and then if I start practicing, I feel better, and if I'm prepared, I feel really good. And then, of course, on the day of, there's a huge energy wave that goes through the roof, and this is sort of how it goes for me. But anyway, in the survey, so we're asking about drug use, mostly. Do people use drugs? Do they self-medicate? So a large amount of musicians, about 57%, reported they deal with MPA sober, and 24% reported self-medication, so marijuana or alcohol of some form. See, 4% reported professional treatment with or without prescription drugs. So perhaps this could mean they went to a mental health counselor to deal with anxiety, perhaps particularly music performance anxiety. And then we have about just under 2% here reported using beta blockers. So that is kind of the breakdown of how we are dealing with our music performance anxiety. So yeah, okay, let's let's keep going. Okay, so now about the quitting aspect. Do musicians often feel like they want to quit performing because of acute music performance anxiety? And a large majority said no, not really, or never, at 63% here. 17% said rarely, 11% said sometimes, 5% said often, 2% said always, and 2% said other. So I'm rounding up here. But so you can see that it's not so much of an issue, but you can gather that it does have significant impact on the collective overall well-being of musicians. So from this series of questions. Okay. And so, and here's like a qualitative snippet here. Sometimes I want to quit because being a poor artist is hard. Performance anxiety doesn't make me want to quit. So it's not so much about the performance anxiety, it's about the conditions. And somebody else said, I just want it to be easier. So don't we all? Okay, 28. This is on burnout. How often in your career have musicians felt burnt out from performing or doing music? And so this is a category I've called the burnout frequency. And you can see that 12% reported never feeling burned out from doing music, which is a small portion. 25% say they rarely feel burned out from doing music or performing. 33% reported sometimes feeling burned out from performing and doing music, and 24% said often that they often feel burned out. And then a 7% category over here reported that they always feel burned out from performing or doing music. So I thought that was an important breakdown of data to have and understand about our community. Burnout is a psychological state in which you cannot re-plug into something you do either for a living or out of passion because you have experienced too much psychological stress repeatedly from doing it. And there's if you happen to be struggling from burnout, I highly recommend a book on burnout. It's called Breaking the Cycle of Burnout. And it actually talks about to overcome burnout, you have to complete a cycle. It's actually a cycle that you have to go through, and you can't pause the cycle. So you just have to go through it. And reading that book helped me personally with some burnout. So yeah, I recommend that for those who are dealing with burnout. Okay, next question, social anxiety. This is, I think, one of the most curious points of the survey for me was to ask musicians, how often do musicians feel social anxiety or avoid social situations where they will see other musicians? So this could perhaps be at a venue or at a jam session or at, perhaps a band or a rehearsal or a scene or something like this. This was the type of data and understanding I wanted to kind of get on how people were feeling about this aspect of doing music that's not talked about so often. So here is the breakdown, right? 23% said they never feel social anxiety or they never avoid social situations with music. 18% said they rarely feel this way. So that's sort of a nice space of people that don't feel anxiety around this aspect. And then we have kind of a large number in the middle here. 37% say they sometimes avoid social situations where they will see other musicians, or they will, feel social anxiety in situations where they're seeing other musicians. And then we have about 20% here who report often and always feeling social anxiety or avoiding social situations, with about 5% reporting this to be an always kind of phenomenon. So I thought that was quite, interesting and pertinent. I'm going to pause here for questions. Do we have any thoughts so far on this? So far, pretty much talking about music performance anxiety and burnout and social anxiety. I could keep going with the survey, or we could discuss these. Just want to take a moment here and do a vibe check.
Well, the breakdown that I see is, or that I've experienced, is between performances, on stage performances, or in a gin mill or other venue, and open jam sessions where there's someone leading the jam session, who has an open door policy, and also is able in some respect to monitor the people who are coming in to play, so that you don't get folks who are just bought an instrument that morning and decided to show up at a jam session and see what they can do. That there was a level of expertise that was expected, and when it's something that's not articulated, but once communicated and everyone is participating in it, it really adds a lot to boosting everyone's confidence in their own playing, because you get into the groove, get into the flow, and you have people standing next to you, egging you on, so to speak, and it in the aftermath reinforces what you're hearing, or what I'm hearing when I'm practicing, and then in a performance situation, finding myself with an additional accumulation of a sensibility that I'm playing better than I was before I experienced that collective communal telepathy that happens in a really happening jam session, or when you have like-minded and spirited players exchanging ideas on a bandstand. And that's the kind of experience that I chalk up maybe 90% of what I feel is my sense of well-being is playing. And I've boiled it down to a simple statement of, it is better to play than not to play in almost every circumstance and situation, except when you don't have any reeds and you're a horn player.
Sure, yes. Having reeds is key.
Yeah.
I would imagine.
Yeah, it quickly turns into a percussion instrument.
Yes, right. You can do the little avant-garde taps with the buttons.
I was thinking more of beating yourself in the head for not taking care of getting reeds.
Right. And isn't that such a funny aspect of it, that when we, maybe aren't prepared, but we know that every time we play, it is good for us. But there can also be this aspect of pain, or ripping the Band-Aid, or, getting your, excuse my French, butt kicked, that there's this part of the culture in jam sessions as well, where the tradition, I think, of jam sessions was meant to find the players that could really play, and so that musicians could find each other. And there's sort of the culture of hazing at jam sessions that has been prevalent for so long and exists today and continues to exist, but is meant to push players to be, better, and to almost inspire, tap into a certain type of adrenaline rush, perhaps. And so I think there's kind of two sides of the coin, but I think that it can also be toxic and come to a place, especially where we've seen a lot of misogyny in these places, and a lot more hazing of uh, women in the scene where it's not so friendly, and non-binary players. And that's where I'm, curious to see if there can be a shift, and where's the balance of trying to balance the connection, and then also maybe the pains from the connection. So um I'm gonna just redirect here, and if I can get maybe a show of hands, if I should keep going with the next part of the survey. Okay, I'll keep going. Thank you for that, Wenzel. It's
Well,
yeah, and like this is the brilliant part of it too, is checking in and hearing each player's experience of uh you know playing and gigging and doing jams and improving as a player. Okay. Oh, and look, here's the next part of the survey. How often have you experienced sexual harassment on a gig or session? Wow, that's quite the transition there. So uh uh and again, there's a breakdown here by gender. So we have male participants reporting never or rarely, um, non-binary or trans musicians somewhere in the middle. And this category was prefer not to say, reported never or rarely. And the female participants reported all over the map here, up to the always, often categories. So we can see that women are experiencing the most amount of sexual harassment on gigs or sessions, where men are experiencing maybe the less amount, and non-binary people somewhere in the middle. So I thought this was interesting, and I think this also ties into burnout categories, because part of burnout is having repeated negative consequences to your attempts to work or do your craft, and that can contribute to burnout as well, and perhaps music performance anxiety, or social anxiety in situations on gigs. So you can kind of see, luckily 50%, or almost 50%, 49% rather, report never having experienced sexual harassment on a gig. So we do have a large number of players who aren't privy or have not experienced this side of things. 28% said rarely, 13% said sometimes, 7% said often, and 3% said always. So I think this is important to note, this aspect of it, and just I'm glad to share this, and start putting the data out there for anybody who it might benefit, and just hope to uplift the collective consciousness on this. Okay, here's the next question, 31. How often does sexism or gender discrimination affect you or your desire to work? So here's the impact on really exploring burnout with pertaining to gender discrimination and sexism. So almost 4% said always, all the time affects their desire to work. That's a similar level of the mostly women reported players who are experiencing harassment all the time. 15% said often, 17% said sometimes, 23%, the largest group, said it rarely affects their desire to work. 15% reported it never affects their desire to work. 2% said, I don't know. And then 15% reported never having been sexually harassed or experiencing sexism while working. So good for them. And 9% reported other in an other category. So thought this is important to gauge, how many people are experiencing what and how it's making them feel. Okay, I'll keep going here. We've got a couple more minutes, I think. Here's a couple qualitative responses to this question, which I thought is actually important to include. So it was often early in my career when I was younger and single that they were reporting harassment or discrimination, and now I don't see it as much. And this is a participant who reported being white, female, age 35 to 44. And then we have somebody quote as saying, I feel a lot of gender and race discrimination. It's very hard to get gigs for a white female who is not super famous already. This is a quote from a participant who reported identifying as female, multi-ethnic racial background between the ages of 55 to 64. Next quote. I used to find myself in more dodgy situations when I was younger, but over the years I've made sure to work only with people I trust, and I don't tolerate crap from anyone. I get one whiff and I'm out, and I like to think I can smell it a mile away. Thankfully, I've never been physically assaulted. So I think this is, I've heard this from similar types of experiences of women working professionally in music, that there seems to be, a filter that you have to develop and deal with. And I think it's an extra, layer of kind of work to handle. Here we have someone, participant, white male, aged 35 to 44. I've never been the target of any of the above, but it still negatively affects me to see it happening to others. And there's a couple other quotes here that I'll just leave up for you to digest. And this brings up an article by Tracy McMullen, I believe is her name, and I believe she is on faculty upstate or perhaps Dartmouth. I'm probably recalling that incorrectly, but she wrote a really incredible article recently that's published in a journal, and it's surveying the sort of intersectionality of harassment and gender and racial social sort of interactions and experiences of harassment and violence that amongst jazz musicians, that I think is a really brilliant article. So I'll have to, I think I'll dig that up and share that with you all if you're interested. And she also notes there's sort of a hierarchical shift in women and non-binary players finally having more opportunities now, thankfully, since the Me Too era of 2017. And I'd almost like to do a class entirely on that topic, because I think that's quite an interesting, notable shift that I've noticed in the scene as well, which is great. So okay, but there's lots within that. Okay, let's see, I'll keep going. Last question of the day. Have you ever intentionally or unintentionally harassed a peer or colleague relating to the basis of their gender? So this was sort of an honesty check. of the collective to see how people might report or reflect on their behavior in the community. And so we have 65% reported saying no, they've never intentionally or unintentionally harassed a peer colleague. 14% said I don't know. 12% said maybe. 5% said yes, and about 5% also said, or a little under 5% reported other. So I thought this was an interesting question, and a couple of responses to this included, I believe I have not, and I actively endeavor not to engage in harassing behavior. However, to answer the question, truthfully, I may not know if some behavior is unknowingly or intentionally harassing, so I try to check in with people to make sure. Sorry for the long answer, but a flat no seemed incomplete. Another person said, I'd like to say never, but I cannot be sure how people have reacted in the past. I've never willingly harassed anyone and never been accused. Another participant said it's more than likely that they have harassed somebody. And another person said no to harassment, but there was a tiny learning curve with my first co-ed lineup from a non-binary participant. And we have another person saying, not that I know of, but of course I could be wrong. So you know, there's kind of a variety of responses that seem to say, you know, yes, intentionally, no, never intentionally, but maybe I did. And so there's a, you know, clarity issue in that. Okay, all right, I'm going to stop one more time. Before we go on to section 7, the pandemic experience, I think I'll save that for next week. And we can just, yeah, I think for the last 5 minutes, check in and yeah, talk about survey. So is there any questions on today's data so far? Or any thoughts? Any thoughts on Jeffrey Keezer's post? Just want to open it up.